organizations. You see people documenting abuse, advocating for fair and equal treatment. And then you see people challenging myths and trying to integrate our ideas and who we are into the mainstream. And at a global level, you see that matched in some way. At a global level, you see activists organizing to say, actually, sexual orientation and gender identity needs to be explicitly included in regional and global human rights forums. Raising visibility through global campaigns and so on to link up activists, so minorities in their own countries, but linked up so they feel strong and empowered and connected to their global family. And then putting pressure on sympathetic governments to make these kind of recognition and acknowledgement of sexual orientation and gender identity, pressure from countries that have got there on other countries that are not doing that. And you see that coming together, the kind of local, national, and the global, in big forums like the United Nations and the Universal Periodic Review, where you see global organizations matching up and working with national level activists to particularly come into that realm of organizing. And let's be clear, it's been very effective. All over the world, things are changing, the kind of public discourse around it. You see presidents talking about gay and lesbians in a way that 10 years ago was unimaginable. You see it as a church issue, you see it on television and so on. So I'm not saying that it's an ineffective strategy at all. But what I want to do is try and unpack what's the theory of change embedded in that way of approaching the issue. And essentially, I think it is that you see civil society identifying a problem, in this case, discrimination. You see civil society then working collectively to gather up evidence, to do the research, to develop advocacy strategies, and to offer solutions to other parts, to policymakers and so on. And then the idea is to take that organizing, raising that visibility, taking those ideas, and to shift how policymakers think and shift laws and ultimately shift norms. But when you look at that model in our context, that's a model that largely works in countries that have a really functioning old democratic system, where you have political parties that get voted in and out of office, where you don't have coups, where you have a freedom of press, where the media can report on a whole lot of things and it's not government-owned media, where you don't have the kind of strong connection between the state and religious bodies and theocracies and things like that. So if we take that theory of change and ask a different set of questions around how's that working here, what I think you see is what I'm going to call a displacement process, where some of the key issues get pushed a little bit aside. So what do I mean by that? I think what you see in our region are very nascent. It's true, girls has been around for 25 years, but they remain a stigmatized small group that has survived because they've worked incredibly hard with a handful of extraordinary brave activists. So many of the organizations are still largely nascent, with limited support, not a lot of money, tackling deep, deep social prejudices, the social policing that goes on and the violence that's associated with that. And it's been very hard simply to get other human rights organizations in the region, let alone governments, to acknowledge that this is a deep problem that is worthy of attention. So what I think you've seen is international NGOs in solidarity stepping into that space to provide support, to provide funding, and to work in solidarity with organizations. But one of the challenges of that kind of solidarity work is when the theoretical thinking, the framing, the research, and the strategies are taken from one place and reproduced in another place that actually contextually is entirely different. And so what you see is what I call this kind of vertical alliance building between small local NGOs and international global advocacy works. And the challenge of that is you end up with the LGBTI community in a silo or isolated from the rest of the social justice and human rights organizations there. So it's a push and a pull. A push because people don't want to deal with us, a pull because there's great international work that is happening. And you see one of the processes of that is this gathering of evidence, the developing of strategic strategies and thinking about how to use that evidence. But the problem with that is that often goes into talking to northern-based governments, the kind of spaces in which global and international NGOs are based. So this evidence gets gathered and it's used to engage in a dialogue with the British government or the American government as a way of saying that this is a global problem. What you also see are a lot of donors funding international NGOs, and that's one of the reasons why it's been very hard to get resources trickling down to little groups here, because they're hard to be seen, it's hard to be accountable, it's hard to get money to them. And what that all results in is pressure being put on governments, sympathetic governments, putting pressure on other governments to move, particularly around decriminalization and other strategies like that. And what you have, unsurprisingly, in a space where the South is growing more and more impatient with being pushed around economically and socially in a post-colonial kind of world, they don't like being told what to do. And what you end up doing is creating, in some space, in some ways, a kind of a backlash against that, and the African governments take it out on small minorities. And sometimes you have some very, very difficult spaces with threats of withdrawing aid, other NGOs feeling like the gays are taking the money away from children or from other spaces. And really, what that process does, I think, most dangerously, is it weakens the way in which our civil society engages with our governments. Like it or not, if we're going to build a world in which a space in which we feel free and able to live a dignified life, we are going to have to get our governments to change. So we're going to have to engage with them in one way or another. And my contention is that displacement process means that in some of the global advocacy spaces, what you see is a displacement of the voices and identities of LGBT Africans, almost being given a choice between being a global activist or an LGBT activist. And that's beginning to change. It's changing more rapidly, particularly over the last couple of years. But that was the starting point to kind of trying to understand why our LGBT sector works the way that it does. So then we looked at what happens if you develop an inclusion strategy? What changes if at the center of our thinking are authentic voices and agency of African LGBTI people? What happens then? And I think that if you do that, I think in a space like ours, you begin to redefine LGBTI issues away from being an individual, rights-based, identity-based space into being a concern around social justice more generally. That if all of us was tomorrow going to get our rights as LGBTI activists, we still would live with undemocratic countries. We still would live with corruption. We still wouldn't have a functioning and medical space that is delivering health to everyone, never mind stigmatized minorities. And I think that if you start asking that set of questions, then what you do is you start to engage with wider social justice organizations, and you get into this horizontal alliance building. And I think that if you do that, then you've got a much better chance of being able to go to African governments and frame the problem in a way that they care about. If you can show the connection between one form of stigmatization and discrimination with a whole range of things, you've certainly got a whole lot of allies, and you can force the government much more easily to sit up and take notice. And I think that's the space from which you need to move to build alliances with international NGOs and global advocacy. And then you go in a much more collaborative, collective space to engage with multilateral spaces. And then you have a much more equal conversation, a pincer approach to engaging with governments. What that analysis takes me to is that demands African resources, and it demands African leadership. And I think that means that we have to be building African philanthropy. We have to be funding, at least in part, ourselves. We have to really be thinking at how do you build philanthropy? How do we create a culture in which even a rand, if there's 1 million people who give that rand, make a difference? So make a small ask to a lot of people, and that becomes a form of activism then, as opposed to a form of writing proposals to other people. So I want to put this in much more practical terms. I've rushed through this at so many different levels, and I just want you to picture how many flip chart sheets of paper I would have had up on the wall by now. So what does this mean in practice? I think that if we're going to have the blue sky dream of saying everyone has the freedom to live a safe and dignified life, have a family, and make their contribution to society, that's inclusive of everyone. That's straight people, that's gay people, that's men, that's women, it's every binary notion that you can imagine, and everybody in between. So let's make a problem statement. Where are we? How far away are we from that blue sky dream? And actually, we're a stigmatized minority. It doesn't matter how privileged you are, you're still stigmatized. People still hate you. Many people still hate you, think you're disgusting, simply because of the way in which you express your love. So we're prevented both by laws and social norms and tradition and culture to achieve these things. So that's a problem statement. And this is one of the things that makes working here so challenging, is that the vast majority of people in our region would not regard that as a problem. They would regard that as an ideal state of affairs. It's not something that they want to see changed very easily. So that's a really deep contextual space that we have to think about what that means. The plus side is that we know as LGBTI people, we are everywhere. It doesn't matter. People may not be out, but we know that there are people at high levels of government, even up to some presidents, it's suggested, who are actually gay. There are members of parliament, there are bankers. We are everywhere. There are people in every congregation who are gay. There are people in every single little village in the middle of nowhere who are grappling with gender diversity and gender identity issues. So we are everywhere. So we need to take those two conflicting things and say, how do we work with that reality? And I think the first thing is what was said again and again. We need to develop an evidence base, but an evidence base not only on human rights violations and those kinds of things, but an evidence base of where do people get information and ideas about sexuality? How do we learn to be men and women? What are the languages that are used to describe these things? What's a mapping of how many of us there are and how we self-define ourselves? Because we need that, and we need that to be deeply grounded in strategies. So part of the reason that it matters what people are doing at a very local level is because they're the best placed people to know exactly what is needed there. We shouldn't be elevating strategy up to somewhere here. We need both of those things. If we have that as a starting point, then I think it allows us to do two things. One, it allows us to do public advocacy in a different kind of a way with key constituencies. It also allows us to engage through our allies into different spaces. It gives us more informed and empathetic spaces to work in. That can lead to changed attitudes and practices. And I think when you begin to shift social norms, the opportunity to seriously change laws and practices and attitudes is in that space. So these are just ideas. This is blue